My name is Myra Whitmore. I am 34 years old, a chief cardiology resident at the prestigious St. Jude's Medical Center in downtown Chicago, and a mother to 3-year-old twins, Leo and Maya. People see the white coat, the Littman Cardiology 4 stethoscope draped around my neck, and the tired but steady hands that have assisted in over 500 open heart surgeries, and they assume I have a life built on a foundation of steel. But the truth is that for 3 decades, I was the human scaffolding holding up a family that viewed me as nothing more than a convenient utility. The shocking reality of my existence hit me with the force of a high-speed collision on a rainy Tuesday evening last October, not figuratively, but literally. I was driving my 2021 Alpine white BMW X5 home after a grueling 36-hour shift, the engine humming a low, expensive purr as I navigated the slick pavement of Lakeshore Drive. I remember the smell of the venticized blonde roast coffee that had gone cold in the cup holder and the soft lullaby playing for my twins who were safely at home with their nanny, Mrs. Gable. Then, there was only the blinding glare of high beams from a 2018 Ford F-150 that had hydroplaned into my lane, the screech of tires, and the sickening crunch of reinforced German engineering yielding to American steel. When the paramedics extracted me from the wreckage, my blood pressure was bottoming out at 80/40, and my vision was tunneling into a narrow pinprick of light. I knew enough as a doctor to recognize the symptoms of internal hemorrhage, the cold sweat, the air hunger, and the dull, radiating ache in my left upper quadrant that signaled my spleen had essentially disintegrated upon impact. By the time the ambulance backed into the trauma bay of my own hospital, I was barely conscious, my skin a translucent shade of porcelain gray. I felt the familiar sting of an 18-gauge IV needle entering my antecubital vein and the frantic rhythm of a level 1 trauma activation. My phone, miraculously intact and buzzing incessantly in the pocket of my blood-stained scrubs, was vibrating against my hip. With a hand that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, I reached for it, expecting my mother, Evelyn, or my father, Arthur, to be frantic with worry after the automated crash notification had surely alerted my emergency contacts. Instead, the screen illuminated with a message that would eventually become the catalyst for the destruction of the Whitmore family legacy. "Myra, you've always been a nuisance and a burden," the text read, sent from my mother's iPhone 15 Pro Max. "We have Taylor Swift tickets with Vanessa tonight in the VIP suite at Soldier Field. Vanessa has been looking forward to this for 6 months, and we are not letting your dramatics ruin her night. Figure it out yourself. Vanessa is my younger sister by 2 years, the golden child who, at 32, still lives in a $400,000 condo in the Gold Coast paid for entirely by me, though my parents told her it was a family gift." As the trauma surgeon, Dr. Eris Thorne, leaned over me with a focused assessment with sonography for trauma probe, his face went grim, seeing the black fluid filling my Morrison's pouch on the monitor. I looked at that text, the blue bubble of iMessage reflecting in my fading pupils, and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with blood loss. I was the one who paid their property taxes on the 6-bedroom estate in Lake Forest. I was the one who covered the $4,000 monthly maintenance fees for my father's 2023 Mercedes-Benz S-Class. I was the one who had funded Vanessa's failed interior design business to the tune of $85,000. And yet, as I lay dying in the very hospital where I saved lives every day, I was a nuisance. The surgery lasted 4 hours. They had to perform an emergency splenectomy and repair a small tear in my diaphragm. When I woke up in the surgical ICU, the room was silent, except for the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator I was being weaned from and the steady beep of the bedside monitor showing a heart rate of 65. There were no flowers from my family, no frantic father pacing the hallway, only Mrs. Gable, my nanny, sitting in the corner with a look of profound pity on her face. She told me that she had called my parents 10 times, and when my father finally answered, he told her to stop harassing them on a holiday weekend and to just put the twins to bed. That was the moment the scaffolding collapsed. I realized that my family didn't love Myra the person, they loved Myra the ATM. They loved the daughter who had worked 3 jobs during her residency to ensure they never had to trade their organic groceries for generic brands. I waited 3 days. I waited until I was moved to a private suite on the VIP floor, ironically a floor I had personally donated $50,000 toward during a hospital gala 2 years prior. I sat up in the adjustable hospital bed, the surgical staples in my abdomen pulling with every breath, and I opened my laptop. My father, Arthur Whitmore, was a man of immense pride but very little actual liquidity. He had spent his inheritance by the time he was 45 and had spent the last decade maintaining the facade of a wealthy patriarch using my earnings. Because I had been so desperate for their approval, I had set up a joint family office account where my salary and investment dividends were deposited and from which all their bills were paid via autopay. I was the primary account holder, the sole owner of the funds, and the only person with the legal right to revoke access. I felt a strange, detached sense of calm as I logged into the Chase private client portal. The balance stood at $342,000, money I had earmarked for my twins' college funds and the final payoff of the Lake Forest mortgage. I looked at the list of authorized users: Arthur Whitmore, Evelyn Whitmore, Vanessa Whitmore. I clicked the Manage Access tab. One by one, I deactivated their titanium credit cards. I watched the screen as I canceled the recurring payments for the Mercedes, the Gold Coast condo, the country club membership at Onwencia that cost $3,000 a month, and the high-speed fiber internet at their estate. Then I initiated a wire transfer to move every single cent into a new private account at a different institution where they had no footprint. But I wasn't done. The Lake Forest house was technically in my name for tax purposes, a move my father had insisted on years ago to shield it from his own creditors. I called my real estate attorney, Marcus Thorne, at 9 a.m. on a Friday. I told him to list the property immediately. I didn't care if they were still inside. I didn't care if the furniture I had bought for them was still in the dining room. I wanted it gone. Next, I contacted the leasing office of Vanessa's condo. Since the lease was in my name, I gave them 30 days' notice and informed them that the security deposit should be returned to my private account. The fallout began at approximately 7:42 p.m. that evening. I was sipping a lukewarm cup of broth and watching the sunset over Lake Michigan when my phone began to explode. First, it was Vanessa. She was at a high-end boutique on Michigan Avenue, likely trying to buy a $3,000 Chanel handbag to celebrate her concert weekend. Her card had been declined. Then came my mother, screaming into the voicemail about the embarrassment of having their dinner tab at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse rejected in front of their friends. Finally, my father called. His voice wasn't screaming. It was low, dangerous, and filled with the entitlement that had defined my childhood. He demanded to know what glitch had happened with the bank and told me to fix it immediately because he had a car payment due and the country club was questioning his standing. I didn't answer. I simply sent a screenshot of the text message I had received while on the gurney. I followed it with a single sentence: "Figure it out yourself." I spent the next hour watching the notifications pour in. The sheer panic in their messages was a symphony of poetic justice. They hadn't realized that without me, they were not the Whitmores of Lake Forest. They were 3 unemployed adults with 0 savings and a mountain of debt that I had been silently carrying. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent in the ICU, the nights I had missed putting Leo and Maya to bed, all so I could provide a life of luxury to people who couldn't even be bothered to check if I had survived a catastrophic accident. The hyper-realism of the situation settled in as I looked at my surgical scar in the mirror of the hospital bathroom. The skin was puckered and red, a jagged line that represented the literal breaking point of my body. My parents had treated me like a machine, an indestructible source of revenue that required no maintenance and no affection. They had forgotten that even the most resilient heart needs a reason to keep beating. As I sat back down, the hospital room felt larger, brighter, and for the first time in my life, entirely mine. The silence was no longer heavy with the weight of their expectations. It was light with the possibility of my own freedom. I was no longer the nuisance. I was the person who held the keys to the kingdom, and I had just changed the locks. By the time I was discharged 5 days later, the house in Lake Forest had 3 offers above asking price. My father had been forced to return the Mercedes to the dealership because he couldn't cover the $6,000 insurance premium and the monthly note. Vanessa was frantically packing her boxes in the Gold Coast, realizing that her sisterly bond didn't extend to a free ride in a luxury high-rise. I moved into a modest but beautiful 4-bedroom home in Lincoln Park, a place where the only sounds were the laughter of my children and the quiet rustle of the wind through the oak trees. I realized that family isn't the people who share your DNA while they bleed you dry. Family is the person who holds your hand in the dark, the person who shows up when the world is crashing down, and the person who treats your life as something precious rather than a burden to be managed. I had lost a spleen, but I had gained a soul, and as I looked at my twins playing on the rug of our new living room, I knew that the price of my freedom had been high, but the cost of staying would have been my very life. To my parents, Helen and Richard Carver, I was always relegated to the role of the practical one, a title that sounded like a compliment but functioned as a life sentence of invisible labor and silent expectations. My sister Vanessa, who is now 37 and still chasing the ephemeral ghost of artistic relevance, was and remains the visionary, a term my mother used to justify every financial catastrophe and emotional whim Vanessa ever had. I remember a specific Tuesday in the spring of 2018 when Vanessa decided she was going to revolutionize the fashion industry from a loft in Portland, Oregon, using $48,000 of my parents' dwindling retirement savings to launch an artisanal streetwear line that consisted mostly of overpriced hemp hoodies and screen-printed nihilism. When the business folded within 6 months, leaving behind a storage unit full of unsold inventory and a mountain of credit card debt, my father patted her hand over a glass of expensive Napa Cabernet and called it a necessary learning curve for a creative soul. Contrast that with the day I graduated at the top of my class from the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, a moment that should have been the pinnacle of my young life. My parents arrived exactly 120 minutes late, missing the commencement speech, the hooding ceremony, and the announcement of my residency placement, because Vanessa had suffered a creative crisis that morning involving the wrong shade of eggshell white paint for her studio. They didn't apologize as they wandered into the reception, smelling of lavender and expensive car leather. Instead, they spent the entire dinner talking about how hard it was for Vanessa to find her authentic voice in a world that didn't value art. For 8 long, grueling years, I lived a life of calculated frugality that bordered on asceticism, while my peers in the medical field were buying their first luxury condos and leasing Teslas. I resided in a cramped, 950-square-foot apartment in a neighborhood of Baltimore that smelled eternally of damp brick and old exhaust, where the radiator hissed like a dying animal every time the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. I drove a 2012 taffeta white Honda Civic with a spiderweb crack snaking across the passenger side of the windshield, a car that shuddered when I took it above 60 miles per hour on the interstate. I wore the same 3 pairs of scuffed black clogs for my hospital shifts and bought my groceries in bulk, all so I could maintain the secret life support system I had built for my parents' lifestyle in Great Falls, Virginia. They lived in a 4-bedroom colonial on a manicured acre of land, believing that their comfort was a natural byproduct of their own merit, when in reality, it was bought and paid for by me. Every single month on the first day, at precisely 9 in the morning, I would log into my portal and wire $2,400 to Wells Fargo to cover their mortgage payment so they wouldn't lose the house they couldn't afford. On the 15th of every month, like clockwork, I would authorize a payment of $814.20 for their premium Blue Cross Blue Shield PPO health insurance, ensuring they had access to the best doctors while I skipped my own dental cleanings to save money. I have a digital file on my password-protected MacBook Pro, a spreadsheet titled Family Support that contains 96 rows of cold, hard, indisputable proof of their parasitism. It is a ledger of every cent I have funneled into their lives, totaling $364,200.41 in gifts that were never once acknowledged with a thank you note or a phone call. Each row is a sting of memory, a record of the $800 for the emergency plumber when their water heater burst, the $1,200 for the new tires on my father's aging Lexus, and the countless $300 infusions for Vanessa's electricity bills when she forgot that being a visionary didn't pay the utility company. They looked at me and saw a boring, dependable machine made of logic and steady paychecks, never suspecting that the machine was keeping a meticulous tally of their neglect. They treated my success as a foregone conclusion that required no celebration, while treating Vanessa's failures as tragedies that required an open checkbook. I sat at their Thanksgiving table last year, listening to my mother brag about Vanessa's new pottery workshop in Vermont, which was actually a 3-week vacation I had indirectly funded, while they didn't even ask me about the research paper I had just published in the New England Journal of Medicine. My father actually had the audacity to ask if I could spare an extra $500 that month because the country club had increased their quarterly dues, and he didn't want to lose his preferred tea time on Sunday mornings. The weight of their entitlement was a physical pressure in my chest, a constant reminder that I was only as valuable to them as the amount of liquidity I could provide. I remember looking at my father's hands, which were soft and well manicured, and then looking at my own, which were calloused from 13-hour shifts and smelled faintly of surgical scrub and latex. He had been a mid-level executive who retired early on a whim, assuming the world would continue to provide for him, while I was a woman who had spent her entire 20s in windowless libraries and high-stress operating rooms. The disparity was staggering, yet in their eyes I was the one who owed them for the privilege of being the responsible child. They didn't see the nights I stayed up late calculating how to stretch my remaining $200 until the next payday because the property taxes on the Great Falls house had gone up. They didn't see the way I winced every time I saw a black SUV that looked like the one that had eventually nearly killed me, or the way I looked at the 2012 Honda Civic and felt a wave of exhaustion at the thought of another year of avoiding the mechanic. My sister Vanessa would call me from different area codes, her voice always airy and distracted, usually ending the conversation with a request for a small loan that we both knew would never be repaid. She'd talk about the energy of the Pacific Northwest or the light in the desert, and I would listen while staring at the flickering fluorescent lights of the hospital cafeteria, eating a $5 sandwich that tasted like cardboard. I was the silent partner in their delusions, the one who kept the lights on and the creditors at bay, all while being treated like an annoying afterthought who lacked the sparkle of their golden daughter. My mother once told me that I was lucky to have such a stable career because I didn't have the temperament for anything more expressive, a comment that cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. She didn't realize that my stability was the only thing preventing her from living in a 2-bedroom apartment in a less desirable zip code. She didn't realize that the very practicality she mocked was the only reason she could still host her bridge club in a house with crown molding and a sub-zero refrigerator. The spreadsheet was my only comfort, a secret weapon I kept tucked away in the cloud, a map of my own martyrdom that I visited late at night when the unfairness of it all became too much to bear. I would scroll through the dates and the amounts, remembering the specific sacrifices I had made for each one. The $4,000 for Vanessa's wisdom teeth surgery that my parents claimed they couldn't cover. The $600 for the designer dress my mother wore to a cousin's wedding because she wanted to look like she was still part of the elite. Each entry was a brick in a wall I was building between myself and the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I realized that they didn't just take my money, they took my time, my youth, and my peace of mind, and they did it with the casual arrogance of people who believe the sun rises specifically to warm their skin. I was the daughter who stayed in the shadows so they could stand in the light, the one who balanced the books while they lived in a fantasy of perpetual abundance. Even now, as I reflect on that period of my life, The sheer volume of the ignored support feels like a heavy fog. $364,000 is not just a number. It is a down payment on a dream house. It is a decade of retirement. It is the cost of 100 missed vacations and 1,000 quiet stresses. It is the price I paid for the hope that one day they would look at me and see more than just a source of funds. I kept waiting for the moment when my father would say he was proud of my medical career, without mentioning how much Vanessa's art inspired him. I kept waiting for my mother to ask how my day at the hospital was without segueing into a story about Vanessa's latest romantic drama. But the realization was starting to settle in, cold and hard like the tiles of the ER floor, that the acknowledgement I craved was never going to come. They were never going to see the 96 rows of proof because they had already decided that my role was to provide and their role was to consume. I was the practical daughter, the one who didn't need the emotional nurturing that Vanessa required, the one who could handle the blood and the stress and the bills while they focused on the visionary pursuit of a life without consequences. The spreadsheet wasn't just a record of their debts. It was a record of my own awakening, a document that proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the people I called family were really just the most expensive acquaintances I would ever have. Every cent was a testament to a love that was entirely one-sided, an investment in a bank that had been insolvent for years, and as I looked at the total amount at the bottom of the screen, I knew that the era of the practical daughter was coming to a very expensive, very permanent end. The exact moment my life fractured into 1,000 irreparable shards of glass and twisted metal happened on a Tuesday at precisely 7:14 p.m., a time that will forever be etched into the internal ledger of my trauma. I was driving my 2021 Alpine white BMW X5, a car I had purchased with the bonuses from 18 months of grueling double shifts in the cardiology department, navigating the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Wacker Drive. The city of Chicago was blurred by a persistent autumn drizzle, the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement in long, distorted streaks of amber and neon. I was thinking about the twins, Leo and Maya, and whether Mrs. Gable had remembered to give them their evening dose of vitamin D drops when the world suddenly tilted on its axis. A distracted driver behind the wheel of a 2018 Oxford white Ford F-15, likely glancing at a glowing smartphone screen rather than the road, ignored a stale red light and accelerated to 45 miles per hour directly into my driver's side door. The impact was a deafening symphony of screeching rubber, the explosive pop of side curtain airbags, and the sickening metallic crunch of reinforced steel buckling like parchment paper. My body was thrown violently against the restraints, my left side absorbing a kinetic force that felt like being struck by a falling building. And as the glass shattered into a billion diamonds, the air was suddenly thick with the sharp, acrid smell of ozone and burnt rubber. As the paramedics from Engine Company 13 arrived and began the methodical, terrifying process of using the jaws of life to cut me out of the wreckage, my first instinct was not for my own survival, despite the searing, white-hot agony radiating from my abdomen. My first instinct was for my 3-year-old children who were waiting for me at home, and the terrifying legal reality that if I were whisked away to surgery without a family member present to take custody, the state might be forced to involve social services. With trembling, blood-slicked fingers, I fumbled for my iPhone 15 Pro, which had been thrown onto the floorboard, and I called my father, Richard Carver. I didn't call to ask for a loan, or for him to pay for the mounting damages, or even for emotional comfort. I called with a desperate, breathless plea for a mere 3 hours of his time so my children wouldn't be traumatized by strangers in a government office while I was under anesthesia. I could hear the muffled sounds of a crowd in the background of the call, the distant roar of a stadium gathering for a night of spectacle. And when my father finally spoke, his voice wasn't filled with the frantic terror of a parent whose eldest daughter had just been nearly killed. Instead, his tone was sharp, brittle, and layered with an unmistakable sense of personal inconvenience, as if my life-threatening emergency was nothing more than a telemarketer interrupting his dinner. "Myra, we are literally walking into the stadium right now. We have the VIP suite tickets for the Taylor Swift show with Vanessa, and the traffic was a nightmare getting here," he said, his words clipping along with a cold, rhythmic impatience that made the blood in my veins feel like slush. He told me not to be dramatic, a phrase he had used since I was 6 years old to dismiss every legitimate pain I had ever experienced. And then he hung up the phone before I could even explain that the paramedics were currently placing a cervical collar around my neck and prepping a level 1 trauma activation. Minutes later, as I lay on the gurney inside the ambulance, the interior illuminated by the rhythmic, strobing pulse of red and blue emergency lights, my phone vibrated with a notification from the family group chat. My mother had posted a photo of the 3 of them, Richard, Helen, and Vanessa, all glowing under the stadium lights, holding overpriced cocktails in plastic souvenir cups, looking like a portrait of suburban bliss. Beneath the photo, Vanessa had sent a text that read, "Myra is probably just mad she didn't get an invite to the suite again," followed by a crying, laughing emoji that felt like a physical blow to my shattered ribs. I sat in that ambulance, the metallic taste of blood pooling in the back of my throat and the scent of the paramedics' latex gloves filling my senses, and I looked at that emoji until the screen blurred. It was in that specific, agonizing clarity of a near-death experience that the scales finally fell from my eyes, revealing the grotesque architecture of my family dynamic for what it truly was. I wasn't a daughter to them, I wasn't a sister, and I certainly wasn't a human being with feelings, fears, or a physical body capable of breaking. I was an interest-free ATM, a high-yield savings account with a heartbeat, a utility that provided the luxury vehicles they drove, the premium health insurance that kept them healthy, and the Great Falls mortgage that gave them their social standing. They didn't love me. They loved the $364,000 I had quietly funneled into their pockets over the last 8 years, while I lived in a 950-square-foot apartment with a drafty window and a car that shook at highway speeds. The laughing emoji was the receipt for a decade of self-sacrifice, a digital confirmation that my worth to them was strictly financial, and that as long as the wires cleared on the 1st of the month, they didn't care if I was in a boardroom or a body bag. The paramedic, a young man named Tyler with a calm, steady gaze, caught my eye and asked if there was anyone else we could call, his voice a stark contrast to the callousness of my own blood relatives. I shook my head, the movement sending a fresh wave of nausea through my system, and I realized that the only person who actually cared if I made it through the night was Mrs. Gable, a woman I paid $15 an hour to watch my children. I watched the rain streaks on the ambulance window as we raced toward St. Jude's Medical Center, the siren wailing a mournful, lonely sound that echoed the emptiness growing in my chest. I thought about the spreadsheet on my laptop, the 96 rows of proof, the thousands upon thousands of dollars I had bled out to ensure they never felt the cold breath of financial instability. I had paid for Vanessa's failed dreams, my father's country club memberships, and my mother's designer wardrobe, all while they looked down on me for being the practical one who lacked their supposed visionary spark. The irony was as sharp as the glass shards still embedded in my scalp. They were currently sitting in a VIP suite paid for by my exhaustion, laughing at the drama of my potential death, while the very person who provided their lifestyle was bleeding out into a trauma suit. When we arrived at the hospital and the doors of the ambulance swung open to reveal the frantic, high-stakes environment of the ER, I felt a strange, icy resolve begin to take hold of me, a numbness that was more than just the onset of physical shock. As the trauma team swarmed around me, shouting out vitals and calling for a portable ultrasound, I didn't think about the pain in my spleen or the grade 3 rupture that was slowly drowning my internal organs in my own blood. I thought about the bank login, the encrypted passwords, and the total control I held over every single facet of their comfortable, parasitic existence. They wanted to watch a show at the stadium while their daughter fought for her life, and I decided right then and there as the anesthesia began to cloud my consciousness that I would give them a show they would never forget. I would let them enjoy their music, their cocktails, and their stolen luxury for one last night, because when the sun rose on Wednesday morning, the Bank of Myra Whitmore would be permanently and irrevocably closed for business. The surgeon, Dr. Eris Thorne, gripped my hand right before they wheeled me into operating room 4, promising me he would take care of me. And for the first time in 34 years, I believed a stranger more than I believed my own father. I realized that family isn't the people who share your genetic code but refuse to share your burden. It is the people who see you in the wreckage and reach in to pull you out. My parents had spent my entire life convincing me that I was a nuisance, a heavy, uninteresting stone in the garden of their lives, when in reality, I was the only thing keeping the garden from being reclaimed by the weeds of their own incompetence. As the mask was placed over my face and the cold, chemical scent of sevoflurane filled my lungs, I didn't pray for my parents' forgiveness or for their sudden arrival in the waiting room. I prayed for the strength to survive the surgery so that I could be the person to finally pull the rug out from under their entitled, ungrateful feet. I was done being the scaffolding for a house that refused to give me shelter, and as I drifted into the blackness of the surgery, I felt a grim, silent satisfaction knowing that the interest-free ATM had just processed its final transaction, and the upcoming overdraft fees were going to be catastrophic. The philosophy of my life had always been one of service and silence, a belief that if I worked hard enough and provided enough, I would eventually earn the seat at the table that Vanessa occupied by birthright. But as I lay on that operating table, my body a map of trauma and my heart a desert of disappointment, I understood that you cannot buy love from people who view you as a commodity. You can only buy their presence, and once the currency runs out, they will vanish like smoke in a windstorm. This wasn't just a car accident. It was an extraction, a violent but necessary removal of the cancer of my family from the healthy tissue of my future. I would wake up smaller, lighter, missing a spleen but carrying a resolve that no Ford F-150 could ever crush. The Taylor Swift lyrics would be echoing in their ears while I was being sutured back together. But by the time they reached the parking lot, the world I had built for them would already be starting to burn, and for the first time in my life, I wouldn't be the one rushing to put out the fire. Recovery was not the cinematic moment of sudden strength I had expected, but rather a cold, lonely clarity that settled into my bones like the damp Chicago autumn air seeping through the hospital's triple-paned glass. During my 5-day stay in room 412 of St. Jude's Medical Center, a room that smelled perpetually of antiseptic wipes and the faint metallic tang of the oxygen flowing through the wall-mounted regulator, I learned the true definition of isolation. The walls were a sterile, unoffending shade of eggshell white, and the only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of the sequential compression devices wrapped around my legs to prevent blood clots. I spent those 120 hours watching the shadows of the clouds drift across the ceiling, waiting for a phone call that never came, and a footstep in the hallway that never stopped at my door. The only person who truly saw me during that time was Marcus, the ER attending who had been there the night I was brought in, and who had inadvertently seen the glowing screen of my phone when those devastating texts arrived. He didn't come to my room with the false cheer of a relative or the rehearsed platitudes of a sibling. He came with 2 cups of decent black coffee from the local roastery and a quiet, professional understanding that sometimes the most dangerous wounds aren't the ones a surgeon can stitch back together. He sat in the rigid vinyl chair in the corner of my room, his own face lined with the fatigue of a 12-hour shift, and he simply existed in the space with me, providing the kind of human presence that my own parents, Helen and Richard Carver, had deemed less important than a set of VIP stadium tickets. My parents didn't call to ask if the surgery had been successful or if the grade 3 splenic rupture had been stabilized without further complications. They didn't send a $15 bouquet of wilted carnations from the Safeway floral department, nor did they send a single hollow text message to check if their grandchildren were being cared for. It was as if, by being in the hospital, I had ceased to be a functioning part of their world, and because I was no longer an active participant in their luxury, I had become invisible. I sat up at 2 a.m. on my 3rd night, the surgical staples in my abdomen stinging with a sharp, localized fire every time I shifted my weight on the thin, crinkling hospital mattress. The hospital was in its deepest lull, the hallway lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, and the distant sound of a monitor alarm chirping from the nurse's station, providing a lonely soundtrack to my realization. I reached for my MacBook Pro, the silver chassis feeling cold against my lap, and the blue light of the screen illuminated the dark room with a clinical intensity that matched my internal state of mind. I opened the Chase Private Client Banking app, the familiar interface appearing on the screen like a map of my own exploited labor. I stared at the recurring transfer section, the digital ghost of my misplaced loyalty. There it was, the scheduled wire for $2,400 set to move from my hard-earned savings into the Wells Fargo account that kept the Great Falls house in my parents' possession. It was a transaction that had happened 96 times before, a silent heartbeat of financial support that they had come to view as their natural right. With 3 steady taps of my finger on the trackpad, a sound that seemed incredibly loud in the silence of room 412, I canceled the transfer. I watched the status change from scheduled to canceled, and then I moved to the secondary payment for their premium PPO health insurance, clicking the delete button with a finality that felt like cutting an umbilical cord. I didn't feel the burning heat of anger or the jagged edges of a desire for revenge. Instead, I felt a strange, buoyant sensation of lightness, as if the $360,000 weight I had been carrying on my shoulders for nearly a decade had been lifted in a single instant. I was no longer the human scaffolding for a crumbling colonial estate in Virginia, and the relief was so profound it made my breath hitch in my chest. Next, I opened my contacts list and scrolled past the names that had once defined my sense of duty. Helen Carver, Richard Carver, Vanessa Carver. One by one, I tapped the small information icon and scrolled to the bottom of the screen to select the block caller option. There were no dramatic goodbye messages, no final explanations of why their behavior was unacceptable, and no opportunities for them to manipulate my guilt. I simply erased their ability to reach me, severing the digital tether that had allowed them to treat my life like an open-ended credit line. I thought about Vanessa, likely waking up in her Portland loft or perhaps still recovering from the Taylor Swift concert, blissfully unaware that the fountain of funds had finally run dry. I thought about my father, Richard, who probably had a tea time scheduled for the weekend, assuming that the world would continue to bend to his will because his practical daughter would always be there to smooth over the rough edges. They had mistaken my silence for weakness and my reliability for an infinite resource, forgetting that even the most durable ATM has a limit, and they had reached mine at 45 miles per hour on a rainy Tuesday night. The clarity of my situation was hyper-realistic, stripped of the emotional fog that had clouded my judgment since I was a child. I realized that for 8 years, I had been paying for the privilege of being ignored. I had been subsidizing my own erasure, funding the lifestyle of people who saw my pain as a nuisance and my survival as a secondary concern to their entertainment. As I sat in the dim light of the hospital room, the IV pole standing like a silent sentry by my bed, I looked at the digital ledger of my new life. I had $342,000 in my primary account, money that was now entirely mine to use for the twins, for their future, and for the life I wanted to build in a house where the walls didn't echo with the demands of ungrateful relatives. The stinging of the staples was still there, a physical reminder of the trauma I had endured, but the mental agony of trying to earn the love of the Carver family had vanished. I was Dr. Myra Whitmore, a woman who had survived a high-speed collision and a lifetime of emotional neglect, and I was finally, for the first time in 34 years, completely free. I looked out the window at the distant skyline of Chicago, the lights of the Hancock Center and the Willis Tower glimmering through the haze. Somewhere out there, the world was moving on, oblivious to the quiet revolution happening in room 412. I thought about the twins, Leo and Maya, and the fact that they would grow up knowing a mother who valued herself enough to walk away from toxicity. I wouldn't raise them to be practical tools for others to use. I would raise them to be visionaries of their own lives, people who understood that loyalty is a two-way street and that blood is not a valid excuse for abuse. The silence of the room was no longer oppressive. It was a sanctuary, a clean slate upon which I could write a new story that didn't include the names Helen, Richard, or Vanessa. I closed my laptop and leaned back into the pillows, the cool air of the room brushing against my face, and for the first time since the accident, I slept a deep, dreamless sleep that wasn't interrupted by the phantom vibration of a demanding text message. When the morning light began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and pale gold, I woke up with a sense of purpose that felt like a physical strength. I didn't check my phone to see if they had noticed the cards being declined or the mortgage payment failing to clear. I knew those calls would come eventually, but they would fall into the void of my blocked notifications. I spent the morning talking to the physical therapist, a woman named Sarah, who complimented my resilience as we took the first tentative steps down the hallway. Each step was a battle against the pain in my core, but each step was also a movement away from the version of myself that existed only to serve the Carvers. I saw Marcus again briefly before he went off shift, and he gave me a small, knowing nod when he saw me standing by the window. He didn't have to ask if I had made the changes I needed to make. The shift in my posture and the steadiness of my gaze told him everything he needed to know. I was no longer a victim of a distracted driver or a parasitic family. I was a woman who had taken back the reins of her own existence. The medical bills would be astronomical, even with my own insurance, but for the first time I didn't care about the cost. I was wealthy in the only way that mattered. I possessed the autonomy to decide who had access to my heart and my bank account. I thought about the Great Falls House, that monument to my father's vanity and my mother's social climbing, and I realized it was just a collection of wood and brick that I no longer felt the need to preserve. If the bank took it, if the grass grew long and the paint peeled, it was no longer my concern. I had spent nearly $400,000 trying to buy a sense of belonging, and it took a near-death experience to realize that the only home I ever needed was the one I carried within myself. I looked at the discharge papers on the bedside table. My name printed in bold, black letters, Dr. Myra Whitmore. It was a name that stood for competence, for survival, and now for a fierce and uncompromising independence. I was ready to leave room 412, leaving behind the ghost of the practical daughter and walking out as the woman who had finally learned the value of her own life. 2 weeks after the silence of my hospital room had been replaced by the chaotic but welcome noise of my twins, Leo and Maya, playing in our new living room, a heavy, authoritative knock sounded at my door that differed from the tentative raps of the delivery drivers or the rhythmic thumping of Mrs. Gable's arrival. Standing on my porch in the crisp morning light of a Virginia autumn was my grandfather, Thomas Carver, a man whose reputation as a retired federal judge was built on a foundation of no-nonsense rulings and a terrifying ability to strip a person's character down to its barest facts with a single piercing look from beneath his salt and pepper eyebrows. He was dressed in a charcoal wool overcoat that cost more than my first 3 cars combined, and he held a mahogany walking stick, not for support, but as a scepter of his enduring influence. He had heard the truth of the accident and the subsequent abandonment not from my parents, who were likely still spinning a web of lies about my sudden financial withdrawal, but from my Aunt Eleanor, the only other Carver who possessed a functional moral compass and a disdain for my father's superficiality. Thomas didn't start the conversation with the hollow platitudes I had come to expect from the rest of my family. He didn't offer a hug or a trite comment about how glad he was that I had survived the grade 3 splenic rupture that had nearly claimed my life on that rainy Tuesday. Instead, he stepped into my entryway, looked at the faint, lingering paleness of my skin, and asked for discovery. a word that in his world meant the absolute, unvarnished disclosure of every relevant fact, figure, and piece of evidence. I spent the next 6 hours in my home office, the whir of my HP LaserJet Enterprise printer providing a mechanical rhythm to the systematic dismantling of my family's facade as I began to pull the digital ghosts of my bank accounts into the physical world. I printed every single PDF statement from January 2016 to October 2024, a mountain of paper that documented the slow, steady bleed of my professional success into the black hole of my parents' and sisters' entitlement. I organized the documents into a heavy, 3-inch thick manila folder, meticulously tabbed by fiscal year with neon yellow dividers, creating a chronological map of my exploitation. There was the $48,000 loss from Vanessa's failed Portland streetwear line, documented in a series of frantic transfers I had made to cover her bounce checks, and the $30,000 in back taxes I had paid for the Great Falls estate when my father conveniently forgot that owning a 6-bedroom colonial came with civic responsibilities. I included the $2,400 monthly mortgage payments, the $814.20 premium PPO health insurance receipts, and the countless smaller infusions for country club dues, designer clothing, and organic grocery deliveries that had been billed directly to my Chase private client account. Each page was a cold, hard witness to a decade of one-sided loyalty, a record of a daughter who had functioned as a silent partner in her own erasure while living in a 950-square-foot apartment and driving a car with a cracked windshield. The centerpiece of the discovery, the piece of evidence that I knew would resonate most deeply with a man who lived his life by the strict clock of the court, was a high-resolution printout of the screenshot I had taken from the gurney in the ER of St. Jude's Medical Center. I had highlighted the timestamp of my mother's Taylor Swift text, 7:22 p.m., and placed it directly next to the official police report I had obtained, which showed my 911 call being logged at exactly 7:14 p.m. The 8-minute window was a damning indictment of their humanity, a chronological proof that while the paramedics were still using the jaws of life to extract my broken body from the wreckage of my BMW X5, my mother was already typing a message to tell me I was a nuisance and a burden. I watched my grandfather's face as he sat at my mahogany dining table, the same table where I had once tried to explain my residency schedule only to be interrupted by Vanessa's complaints about a bad hair day, and I saw the judge return to his eyes. He didn't skim the documents. He read them with the predatory focus of a man looking for the smallest inconsistency, his fingers tracing the rows of my spreadsheet where I had calculated the total of $364,200.41 in unacknowledged gifts. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the static of a brewing storm as the silence stretched into its second hour, broken only by the sound of Thomas turning a page or the distant, muffled laughter of my children in the backyard. I sat across from him, my posture straight, despite the dull, lingering ache in my abdomen where the surgical staples had only recently been removed, feeling a strange sense of detachment. I wasn't the practical daughter begging for a seat at the table anymore. I was a witness providing testimony against the people who had treated my life as a line of credit. I watched the way his jaw tightened when he reached the section on the Lake Forest estate taxes, a property he had helped my father acquire 40 years ago, and which was now technically mine, because my father had been too afraid of his own creditors to keep it in his name. Thomas looked up at me, his eyes reflecting a mixture of profound disappointment in his own son and a new, sharp respect for the granddaughter he had largely ignored because she was too quiet, too reliable, and too busy working to perform for his attention. He closed the manila folder with a definitive heavy thud that sounded like a gavel hitting a bench, and for the first time in my 34 years, he addressed me not as a child to be managed, but as a peer who had been deeply and systematically wronged. He spoke about the nature of a contract, not just the legal ones I had printed out, but the unspoken social contract between a parent and a child, a contract that Helen and Richard had breached with a callousness that he found personally offensive to his sense of order. He noted the precise timing of the Taylor Swift text again, calling it a piece of evidence that spoke to a level of premeditated negligence that no amount of family history could excuse. I told him about the laughing emoji from Vanessa, the digital spit in the face that had arrived while I was being prepped for an emergency splenectomy, and I saw a flash of genuine anger cross his weathered features. My grandfather was a man who valued legacy, but he valued the truth even more, and the truth contained within that folder was a narrative of parasitic greed that had nearly cost me my life. He didn't ask me what I wanted him to do, because a man like Thomas Carver doesn't ask for permission to exert his will. He simply informed me that the discovery phase was over and the trial of my parents' standing in the Carver family was about to begin. I walked him to the door, the weight of the manila folder now in his hands, and I felt a tectonic shift in the foundation of my world. For years, I had been the one providing the proof of my worth, sending the money and showing up for the holidays, only to be told that I was the burden. Now, the burden of proof had shifted to them, and they were standing on a foundation of sand with a tide of $360,000 worth of evidence coming in fast. As Thomas stepped back out into the autumn air, he paused and looked at the 2012 Honda Civic parked in my driveway, the one with the cracked windshield and the shuddering engine that I had driven for nearly a decade so I could pay their mortgage. He didn't say anything, but the way he touched the handle of his walking stick told me that he had noted that final, hyper-realistic detail of my sacrifice. I closed the door and leaned my back against the wood, listening to the sound of his black 2024 Cadillac CT6 pulling away from the curb with a smooth, expensive hum. The house was quiet again, but the silence was different now. It was no longer the lonely silence of room 412, but the anticipatory silence of a person who has finally handed over a heavy load to someone stronger. I looked at my hands and realized they were no longer shaking. I had provided the discovery, I had documented the betrayals, and I had mapped out the financial ruin that was currently unfolding in Great Falls and Portland. My parents would soon learn that the practical daughter was the only thing standing between them and the harsh reality of their own choices, and that by treating me like a nuisance, they had discarded their only advocate. The moral of our family history was being rewritten in real time, shifting from a story of my sister's visionary genius to a story of a daughter's cold, calculated reclamation of her own life. Family isn't just about who shows up for the photos or who gets the VIP tickets. It's about who holds the records when the lights go out and who is willing to stand in the courtroom of truth and say, "Here is what it cost me to love you." As I walked back into the kitchen to start the twins' lunch, cutting organic strawberries into small, manageable pieces and pouring milk into their favorite blue cups, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any I had ever known. I was no longer waiting for a phone call or a thank you that was never going to come. I had moved past the need for their acknowledgement because I finally had my own. The spreadsheet was no longer a secret weapon I hid in the cloud. It was a blueprint for my freedom that had been verified by the highest authority I knew. The $364,000 was gone, a sunk cost in the education of Myra Whitmore, but the future was an open ledger where every entry would be for me, for Leo, and for Maya. The Carver family name might still carry weight in the country clubs of Virginia, but in the small, sunlit kitchen of my new home, the only name that mattered was mine, and the only rulings that would ever be handed down again would be my own. The venue for the final reckoning was my grandfather's sprawling estate in McLean, Virginia, a 6,000-square-foot colonial masterpiece of red brick and white shutters that sat at the end of a long, winding driveway lined with ancient, towering oaks. It was Thomas Carver's 70th birthday, and the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, expensive catering, and the palpable tension of 45 family members gathered under the crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom. I pulled my 2012 taffeta white Honda Civic into the line of luxury vehicles, its cracked windshield catching the glint of the moonlight, looking like a scarred soldier among the ranks of pristine Range Rovers and polished Audis. I sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, the engine ticking as it cooled, and I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was dressed in a simple navy silk sheath dress, but over it, I had donned my white lab coat, the heavy fabric embroidered with Dr. Myra Whitmore, chief cardiology resident in clinical black thread. This coat was my armor, a physical manifestation of the 80-hour work weeks, the years of clinical excellence, and the literal blood, sweat, and tears that had funded the very party happening inside those walls. I stepped out of the car, clutching the heavy manila folder, the Discovery, against my chest, and I could feel the surgical staples in my abdomen pull slightly, a sharp reminder that while I was here to provide evidence, my body was still a map of the trauma they had ignored. I walked through the double mahogany front doors at exactly 8:15 p.m., the warmth of the interior hitting me, along with the soft, rhythmic clinking of silverware against fine bone china. The room was a sea of carvers and their associates, a collection of people who valued the appearance of stability over the substance of integrity. My parents, Helen and Richard, were positioned near the grand fireplace, the focal point of a small circle of cousins and old family friends. They looked radiant in the soft light, my mother swirling a glass of $90 Veuve Clicquot, and my father leaning back with the practiced ease of a man who didn't have a single financial worry in the world. As I approached, I stayed in the shadows of the foyer for a moment, long enough to hear my mother's voice carrying across the room, pitched in that specific tone of performative tragedy she reserved for public consumption. She was telling the group that I had unfortunately suffered a mental break following my accident, that the trauma had left me unstable and prone to erratic outbursts, and that they were doing their best to manage my deteriorating condition with grace and patience. It was a masterful lie, a preemptive strike designed to discredit anything I might say or do, painting my absence and my financial withdrawal as the symptoms of a shattered mind rather than the logical consequences of their own betrayal. Standing next to them was Vanessa, looking every bit the visionary in a $1,200 Gucci GG monogram silk dress that shimmered under the light, a garment that had almost certainly been purchased with the $5,000 emergency infusion I had wired her last Christmas when she claimed she couldn't afford her heating bill. She was laughing, her head tilted back, showing off the pearl necklace that had belonged to our grandmother, another gift that had been promised to me but diverted to her because she was the one who appreciated beauty. The sheer audacity of the scene was hyper-realistic, a tableau of parasitic consumption funded by the woman they were currently slandering to anyone who would listen. I felt a cold, crystalline calm wash over me, the kind of stillness that precedes a massive cardiac event, and I began to move through the crowd. The conversations died down in a ripple of hushed whispers as people noticed the woman in the white lab coat walking toward the center of the room, her expression unreadable and her gait steady, despite the phantom pain in her side. I didn't stop to greet my mother or father, and I didn't acknowledge the shocked gasp that escaped Vanessa's lips as she realized I was standing 5 feet away from her. I didn't say a single word, because words were the currency of the carvers, and they were experts at devaluing them with lies and emotional manipulation. Instead, I bypassed them entirely and walked straight to the head of the long, linen-draped table where my grandfather, Thomas, sat in his high-backed velvet chair like a king presiding over a fractured court. He looked up at me, his eyes moving from the name on my lab coat to the folder in my hands, and I saw a flicker of the same no-nonsense resolve that had made him a legend on the federal bench. I leaned over and placed the 3-inch thick manila folder directly in front of him, the sound of it hitting the table sounding like a gavel strike in the sudden vacuum-like silence of the ballroom. I met his gaze for 3 seconds, a silent confirmation that everything he had asked for was inside, tabbed, documented, and irrefutable, and then I stepped back, finally turning to face my parents. My father's face had drained of color, the tan he had cultivated at the country club turning into a sickly, sallow gray as he stared at the folder, recognizing the Chase private client logo visible through the clear cover page. My mother's hand trembled, a few drops of the expensive champagne splashing onto her silk blouse, but she remained frozen, her mouth slightly open as the narrative she had been spinning began to unravel in real time. Vanessa looked from me to the folder and back again, her visionary facade crumbling into the panicked expression of a child who had been caught with her hand in a jar that was now permanently empty. They were waiting for me to scream, to cry, or to provide them with the erratic behavior they had promised the guests, but I gave them nothing but the cold, clinical reality of my presence. I was the chief resident, the surgeon, the woman who had survived a grade 3 splenic rupture while they were singing along to pop songs in a VIP suite, and I was done being the silent engine that powered their delusions. Thomas Carver didn't wait for the party to end. He opened the folder right there, in front of 45 members of the family, and began to slowly turn the pages. The rustle of the paper was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic counting down of the seconds until the Carver legacy was dismantled by the truth. He looked at the 2016 statements, the 2018 Portland streetwear transfers, and finally, he reached the 2024 section where the police report and the Taylor Swift text message were paired together in a damning display of chronological cruelty. I watched as he traced the 7:14 p.m. timestamp of my 911 call and then moved his finger to the 7:22 p.m. timestamp of my mother's text, his jaw set in a line of iron that signaled a final, irrevocable ruling. The guests began to shift uncomfortably, sensing that the theater of the Carver family was being replaced by a trial where there would be no appeals and no pardons. My father tried to step forward, his voice a pathetic croak as he started to say my name, but my grandfather raised one hand, a gesture that had silenced the most arrogant lawyers in the country, and my father stopped as if he had hit a wall. I felt a strange sense of peace as I stood there in my white coat, the fabric heavy and meaningful against my skin. For 8 years, I had lived in a 950-square-foot apartment so they could live in a colonial. I had driven a car with a cracked windshield so they could drive luxury sedans. I had sacrificed my sleep, my youth, and my peace of mind to buy a seat at a table that was built on a foundation of my own exploitation. But as I looked around the room at the expensive art on the walls and the $90 bottles of wine, I realized that I didn't want a seat at this table anymore. I had built my own table in a house in Lincoln Park, a table where the only guests were people who stayed when the truth came out. I wasn't the practical daughter or the visionless burden. I was the one who had the strength to walk away from the wreckage of a family that only valued me for my liquidity. The moral of the story was finally clear. Family isn't the blood that flows through your veins, it's the people who are willing to bleed for you when you're on the ground. And in that regard, I was the only Carver in the room who had ever truly understood the meaning of the word. As my grandfather looked up from the final page of the spreadsheet, the total of $364,200.41 glowing on the paper, he looked at his son and daughter-in-law with a contempt that was more devastating than any prison sentence. He didn't speak to them. He looked back at me and gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement, a recognition of the discovery I had provided and the sentence I had already carried out by closing the accounts. I turned around and walked out of the ballroom, the heels of my shoes clicking a steady, confident beat on the hardwood floors. I didn't look back to see my mother's tears or Vanessa's frantic explanations. I walked out into the cool Virginia night, the air smelling of pine and freedom, and I climbed back into my 2012 Honda Civic. As I drove down the oak-lined driveway, leaving the McLean estate behind me, I reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror, looking not at the house, but at the road ahead. I was Dr. Myra Whitmore, and I was finally going home to a life that belonged entirely to me. The execution of the Carver family's social and moral standing was performed with a clinical, surgical precision that would have made the finest trauma surgeon at St. Jude's Medical Center nod in silent professional approval. My grandfather, Thomas Carver, stood by the massive hand-carved limestone fireplace of his McLean estate, his presence expanding until he seemed to occupy every square inch of the 6,000-square-foot colonial home. He did not need to raise his voice or resort to the undignified shouting matches that my father often used to dominate a room. Instead, he reached for his seasoned bench voice, a low, resonant baritone that had commanded federal courtrooms for over 30 years and could make a seasoned litigator's knees tremble with a single inflection. The festive chatter of the 45 family members present, the clinking of the $90 Veuve Clicquot flutes, and the soft ambient music all died away instantly as he looked directly at my father, Richard Carver, who was still standing with a practiced air of unearned nobility. Thomas didn't start with an accusation. He started with a simple, foundational question of fact, asking Richard who exactly had been paying the property taxes and the monthly mortgage installments on the 4-bedroom Great Falls estate he had been occupying for the last decade. My father, true to a lifetime of narcissistic delusion and the desperate need to maintain appearances in front of the Carver clan, didn't hesitate to weave one final pathetic lie, claiming with a dismissive wave of his hand that his various private investments and consulting fees had covered every cent of their lifestyle. That was the exact moment the heavy manila folder, the physical manifestation of my decade of silent sacrifice, was opened by the one man in the world whose judgment my father actually feared. The room went deathly silent, a heavy, suffocating vacuum where the only sound was the crisp, rhythmic turning of the tabbed PDF statements I had spent 6 hours printing and organizing by fiscal year. My grandfather began to read the numbers with the cold, detached accuracy of a forensic auditor, his voice cutting through the stillness like a scalpel. He started with the mortgage, calling out the $230,400 in direct wire transfers I had made from my Chase private client account to Wells Fargo since 2016 to prevent them from losing the roof over their heads. He moved down the line to the $76,800 in premium PPO health insurance premiums I had covered while I was pulling 80-hour weeks as a chief cardiology resident. And then he hit the $45,000 in miscellaneous emergencies, a category that included everything from Vanessa's failed Portland streetwear line to the designer gowns my mother wore to hide the fact that they were functionally insolvent. The guests, including high-ranking cousins and family friends who had always looked down on me as the practical, uninteresting daughter, stared in stunned disbelief as the ledger of my parents' parasitic existence was laid bare on the hardwood floor of the McLean ballroom. Then came the part of the discovery that turned the financial betrayal into a moral catastrophe, the piece of evidence that stripped away the last shreds of my mother's dignity. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses and read the text message I had received while lying on a gurney in the ER with a grade 3 splenic rupture, his voice echoing the words nuisance and burden with a stinging, deliberate emphasis. He read the timestamp, 7:22 p.m., exactly 8 minutes after I had placed a 911 call while being cut out of the wreckage of my 2021 Alpine White BMW X5, a time when my parents were busy scanning their VIP Taylor Swift tickets at Soldier Field. I watched my mother's face, which had been glowing with expensive moisturizer and pride moments before, turn the exact sickly shade of her cream silk blouse as the reality of her cruelty was broadcast to the entire Carver family. Aunt Eleanor, the only relative who had ever shown me a shred of genuine empathy, let out an audible, horrified gasp that seemed to punctuate the collective realization that my parents had essentially left their eldest daughter to die because she was an inconvenience to their social calendar. My father, backed into a corner of his own making, tried to pivot one last time, stammering that the $364,000 wasn't a gift, but a long-term loan he intended to repay, but I took 2 steps forward, my white lab coat bright and stark under the chandeliers, and asked him a single devastating question. I asked him for the promissory note, the legal document that would substantiate his claim of a loan, and the silence that followed was more profound than any sound I had ever heard in my 34 years of life. My father had nothing but the frantic, shifting movement of his eyes and the sound of his own heavy breathing as he realized that the practical daughter had finally stopped playing by the rules of his fantasy. The only other sound in the grand room was the sudden, sharp crash of Vanessa dropping her crystal glass onto the polished hardwood, the $90 champagne pooling around her $1,200 Gucci shoes like a metaphor for the entire Carver legacy, shattering into irreparable shards. She looked at me with a mixture of terror and realization, seeing for the first time that the interest-free ATM was not just closed, but was now actively testifying against her in the highest court of our family. I stood there, my hands steady and my heart beating with a rhythmic, healthy pace that felt like a victory, watching the people who had erased me for a decade realize that they had finally run out of other people's money and other people's mercy. The hyper-realism of the moment was overwhelming. I could smell the ozone of the cooling fireplace, the scent of the expensive catering that I had indirectly funded, and the sharp, metallic tang of my parents' fear as they stood before the patriarch of the family. My grandfather looked at the folder and then at the three people who had spent my entire adult life bleeding me dry, and he made a ruling that was as final as any he had ever handed down from the bench in D.C. He informed them that as of that moment, the Great Falls house, which was legally in my name to protect it from my father's creditors, would be listed for sale, and the proceeds would be placed in a trust for my twins, Leo and Maya. He stated that the family name would no longer be a shield for their incompetence, and that the era of subsidizing their vanity with my labor was over, effective immediately. My mother tried to reach out to me, her voice a thin, desperate whisper of my name, but I simply adjusted the stethoscope around my neck and turned my back on her, a gesture that was 8 years in the making. I realized that the $364,200.41 was gone, but the weight it had placed on my soul had been liquidated along with their status, leaving me with a balance of pure, unadulterated freedom. The philosophy of my life had been fundamentally altered in the span of a 15-minute execution. I had learned that you cannot fix a broken family with a bank account, and you cannot earn the love of people who view your survival as a nuisance. Family isn't the people who stand in the VIP suite while you're in the trauma bay. Family is the grandfather who stands in the fire and calls for the truth, and the children waiting at home in Lincoln Park who love you whether you're a chief resident or a patient in room 412. As I walked out of the McLean estate for the final time, the cold Virginia air felt like a benediction on my skin, clearing away the last lingering scent of my parents' desperation and the stale smell of the hospital that had birthed this new version of myself. I climbed into my 2012 Honda Civic, the car they had mocked for years while I paid their mortgage, and I felt a surge of pride that I had never felt in their presence. I was the practical daughter who had orchestrated the most visionary move of all, the complete and total reclamation of my own life, and as I pulled away from the colonial house that was no longer my responsibility, I knew that the ledger was finally perfectly balanced. The moral of the Carvers would be written in the empty rooms of the Great Falls estate and the declined credit cards of Portland, but my story would be written in the quiet, honest moments of a life that I had finally earned the right to live for myself. The aftermath of that evening at the McLean estate was not a slow decline, but a total and instantaneous collapse of the Carver family hierarchy, a structural failure that mirrored the way a building implodes when its primary load-bearing pillar is removed. Without my $3,200 monthly infusion, a sum that had quietly covered the $2,400 mortgage and the $814 in premium health insurance for years, the fragile ecosystem of my parents' existence simply ceased to function. They had lived for so long on the interest of my exhaustion that they had forgotten how to exist within the boundaries of their own actual means, which were virtually non-existent. Exactly 30 days after my grandfather, Thomas Carver, witnessed the irrefutable evidence of their parasitic behavior, the 4-bedroom colonial in Great Falls, Virginia, was forced onto the real estate market, its manicured lawn and crown moldings no longer a testament to their success, but a monument to their exploitation. I watched from a distance as the listing appeared on Zillow for $1.2 million, knowing that the equity from that sale would finally be diverted away from their country club dues and into a protected educational trust for my twins, Leo and Maya, ensuring that the labor of their mother would benefit the next generation rather than subsidizing the vanity of the previous one. The move was a brutal, hyper-realistic descent for Helen and Richard Carver, who were forced to swap their sprawling estate for a cramped two-bedroom rental in a significantly less desirable zip code where the sounds of traffic replaced the quiet rustle of the McLean Oaks. They had to sell the furniture I had bought them, the designer rugs that had felt soft under their feet while they sent me texts calling me a nuisance, and the high-end appliances that had remained clean because they rarely cooked for themselves. My father, Richard, who had spent his life pretending to be a titan of industry, found himself in a world where his declined credit cards were no longer a glitch, but a permanent reality of his new standing. Vanessa suffered the most public and humiliating fall from grace, as the news rippled through our social circles that her visionary lifestyle in Portland and her designer wardrobe were entirely funded by her sister's grueling 16-hour shifts in the cardiac ICU. The friends who had once admired her creative spark vanished the moment she could no longer afford the $300 dinner tabs or the weekend trips to Vermont, leaving her to face the staggering truth that her entire identity had been an expensive fiction authored by my paycheck. I have kept the blocks on their phone numbers with a clinical resolve that surprises even me, a decision rooted not in a desire for revenge, but in a fundamental need for self-preservation. I no longer wake up at 3 a.m. to the phantom vibration of a demanding text message or the crushing anxiety of a property tax bill that isn't mine to pay. The silence from their side of the world is a gift I have finally given to myself, a boundary made of reinforced steel that no amount of family guilt or staged creative crises can penetrate. My life in our new home in Lincoln Park is defined by a sense of profound, quiet peace, a home where the air is light and the atmosphere is entirely devoid of the suffocating weight of $364,000 in unacknowledged debt. I spend my evenings on the rug with Leo and Maya, watching them build towers out of wooden blocks and listening to their laughter, knowing that every cent I earn now goes toward their nutrition, their clothes, and the security of their future. My 2012 taffeta white Honda Civic has been replaced by a 2024 black Volvo XC90, a car built for safety and durability, paid for entirely with the money that used to vanish into the black hole of the Great Falls mortgage. Looking back at the jagged scar on my abdomen from the emergency splenectomy, I no longer see it as a mark of a tragedy, but as a symbol of my liberation, the literal breaking point where the practical daughter died and the autonomous woman was born. The collision with the Ford F-150 on that rainy Tuesday was the most violent event of my life, yet it was also the most clarifying, stripping away the illusions of family loyalty to reveal the parasitic rot beneath. I realized that the people who share your DNA are not entitled to your life, your labor, or your sanity, especially when they view your survival as an inconvenience to their entertainment. I have learned that the only people who deserve a seat at my table are the ones who were willing to sit in the hard vinyl chairs of room 412 while I was unconscious and bleeding. My grandfather still visits on Sunday afternoons, his black Cadillac CT6 idling at the curb as he brings a small toy for the twins and a sense of order to our home that was missing for 34 years. He never mentions my parents, and I never ask, because we both understand that the discovery phase is over and the verdict has been rendered. The philosophy I live by now is one of fierce and uncompromising boundaries, a recognition that being the responsible child does not mean being a sacrificial lamb for the whims of the entitled. I am a chief cardiology resident, a mother and a survivor, and the value of my life is no longer determined by how much liquidity I can provide to people who do not love me. The twins will grow up in a house where the word family means protection and presence, not a financial transaction or a tool for manipulation. I see the world with a hyper-realistic clarity now, noticing the way the sunlight hits the kitchen counter in the morning and the way the wind moves through the trees in the park, small details of an ordinary life that feel like luxuries because they are finally mine to enjoy. The Carvers of Great Falls are a ghost story I no longer tell, a cautionary tale of what happens when you mistake a person's kindness for a bottomless well. I think about that night at Soldier Field often, not with bitterness, but with a strange sense of gratitude for the absolute coldness of that text message. It was the final, necessary evidence I needed to stop trying to buy the affection of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I realized that my sister's visionary spark was nothing more than the reflection of my own hard work, and my parents' social standing was a house of cards built on my silent endurance. Now, as I walk through the hospital corridors in my white lab coat, I carry myself with a weightless grace, knowing that the $360,000 burden has been liquidated and the accounts are finally settled. I am Dr. Myra Whitmore, and I have learned that the greatest medical miracle I ever performed wasn't on a patient in the OR, but on my own life, when I finally cut out the toxicity that was draining my heart. The moral of this entire journey is that family is who stays when the truth comes out, the people who show up without an invoice and leave without a debt. It is the person who holds the door for you when you are too weak to walk, and the person who reminds you that your worth is not a number on a spreadsheet. I have found my peace in the quiet corners of Lincoln Park, in the steady rhythm of a successful career that serves my children rather than my father's country club membership, and in the profound realization that I am enough exactly as I am. The Carver hierarchy has collapsed, leaving only the rubble of their vanity, but from that debris I have built a sanctuary of truth and integrity. My story is no longer a tragedy of neglect. It is a triumphant narrative of reclamation, a testament to the power of a single bank login to dismantle a lifetime of lies and set a practical daughter free. I look at my children, and I know that they will never have to be the practical ones who pay for the visionaries' failures, because I have already paid the price for all of us. As the sun sets over the Chicago skyline, I feel a warmth that has nothing to do with a VIP suite and everything to do with the fact that for the first time in my life, I am not a nuisance, I am not a burden, and I am finally home.